All right, good morning and hello to all of our friends from around the globe. Welcome to this month's webinar, Open Source and You, What Everyone Absolutely Needs to Know, sponsored by Barco. So just so everyone knows, after the webinar, you can watch the series on SIIMU. Just go ahead and navigate into the SIIM.org website and search for the SIIM22 webinar series. You can also watch the SIIM21 series in its entirety by searching the SIIM21 webinar series. If you're looking for more information and how-tos on enterprise imaging and open source, be sure to visit the SIIM.org website where you can find a host of activities, publications, and resources, not just on enterprise imaging, but also on things like open source, our upcoming hackathon, the SIIM22 website, and more. Next slide. Today, we are pleased to welcome Mohannad Hussain, Principal Consultant of Techie Maestro. Mohannad is an independent consultant in imaging informatics and a proud longtime SIIM member. A software developer by training, he stumbled into medical imaging informatics more than a decade ago and found his purpose there, never losing sight of the important role our industry can play in improving healthcare. Mohannad is a keen advocate for interoperability in healthcare and a staunch supporter of the open source software. I would also like to thank Mohannad for all of his volunteer work that he does for the SIIM Hackathon and many other programs that SIIM offers. Welcome, Mohannad.
Thank you so much for the kind introduction, Nikki, and hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you find yourself. Today, I'm hoping to have some new information for everybody here, whether you are somebody who's familiar with open source software or you're not. I'm hoping to show you that open source is everywhere. And I'm going to elaborate a bit more on that to show you what I mean by everywhere. But let's just say that just about any piece of technology you interact with has at least some component of open source. And what I'm also hoping to do is hoping to win everybody's heart and change their minds as far as considering open source when you have new needs to be able to do something. And of course, one thing I want to say here, this webinar, the point here isn't to take a stab at any of the commercial vendors, any of that. This is not this versus that. This is just to say that open source is always an option. So there's always room for commercial software to do specific things, but there's also room for open source to solve other needs. Sometimes you have something that comes up that you don't have a budget to spend on software or something, or maybe you just want to go above and beyond. Open source is a nice solution to fill that niche. And then I'm also hoping that you're going to take your learnings from today and educate others in your organization, in your circles, about open source, because I talk to a lot of people and I find there's a lot of misconception about open source. So without further ado, let's get into it. I want to acknowledge the lovely people you see on this slide. They've been kind enough to review my slides, provide a lot of input. This webinar would not be complete without the time and effort of all these people helping me get it to where it is now. Let's start by dissecting the two words, the two magical words here. So open and source. Open in this case is free to use. Now, I'm not a marketing person, so I don't like to use asterisks here, but it is required. And we're going to talk a little bit more about what it means. But as an overall, it's basically, it depends on the license terms. So it's important that when you pick up something that is open source, that you understand the license that it comes with it. And of course, the source, the generic word I'm going to use here is blueprints. So blueprints could mean really anything. And again, we're going to elaborate a bit more about that in just a moment. Let's talk about licenses, though. So here on my screen, I've gathered 3 examples of popular licenses. This is not inclusive by all means. There's a ton more out there. But here you have, from left to right, you have MIT, GPL, Apache, and Creative Commons. So I'm not a lawyer and I'm not here to dispense legal advice, but I will say that when you are picking up a piece of open source software or otherwise, you definitely want to look at the license terms and figure out what it means as far as what limitations there might be on your use, your distribution, your modification. For example, some software licenses will allow you to use something, but you cannot incorporate into something they can ship as commercial software. Others will allow you. There are some licenses that require you, if you were to make modifications to the open source code, to release that back to the community, which might be an option for you, might not be an option. So again, it pays to read the license, and if you're not sure, consult a lawyer. Now, we talked about the source being essentially blueprints, which could be anything. So here I want to show you a couple of examples. This one is one that made the news back in 2014 when Tesla, the famous electric car company, decided to open source their patents. So really what that means in this case is they're basically allowing everybody to use their patents without royalties. So that's one example of open source. Another example is this 3D printing community on the internet called Thingiverse. So here you can basically pick up a design that somebody else made, send it to your 3D printer, and voila, you have a copy of basically their intellectual property. And the cool thing about this is, think about it, somebody may have gone on this website and made, let's say, for example, an accessory, I don't know, like a phone case for a Samsung phone. You can now take it and adapt it to your needs. Maybe you're an iPhone user, so you can now adapt that case design to your iPhone, and then you print a copy, and voila, you've got it. And hopefully, of course, you don't forget to upload your modified design, so the community benefits from this. But we'll get to that later. Open source also applies to things like standards. So DICOM and HL7 Fire are essentially open source. Now, some of you are going, duh, what else would they be? So for those, I just remind you of the old days when we had HL7 V2 and you had to pay to get a copy of that CD, because that was not open source. So that's what the difference is. So that was a fundamental change when HL7 came out with Fire, was to say it's open source, anyone can get the text, anyone can use it. The actual license they have here is Creative Commons. So again, if you want to find out what it is you can do or cannot do, you can head over to their website and look at their license terms. Here, I tried to gather some examples of open source software that any of you would have at least used once in their life before. I know some of them might not be recognizable, but hopefully some others will be very, very recognizable. And the ones that are not recognizable are actually there for a good reason, because there's a good chance you've interacted with them without even realizing. So I'm just going to start here with Wikipedia. So everybody here has used Wikipedia. There's no question about it. Wikipedia actually runs on open source software. If you wanted to run your own version of Wikipedia, you can actually get a copy of that software. You can run your own version of Wikipedia. Now, keep in mind here, I'm talking about the underlying software, not the actual content. So a lot of organizations will use a copy of that software to manage knowledge and content within their organization. It's a nice way of doing it. The other one you see on my screen here is WordPress, where some of you may know it, some of you may not. WordPress is an extremely popular content management system that is often used to create websites. A statistic recently said that 37% of internet websites are actually running WordPress, which then leads me to the next one, Apache HTTP server. And again, maybe not something a lot of you have heard of, but Apache HTTP server is a web server that is open source. And a statistic recently said that 65% of internet websites run open source web servers, Apache being a prominent example. Of course, the other examples here do not need introductions. Firefox, I'm sure everybody's used Firefox at some point in their life. Python, the popular programming language, VLC Media Player with its legendary reputation of being able to play just about any video file, right? And remember, the thing with open source is open source can stack up. So for example, maybe you're an Android user, which is open source, and you're using Chrome, which also is based on open source, to access Wikipedia, which is open source, using Apache HTTP server. So you see like how the different pieces of the puzzle actually come together here to make the software experience complete for everybody. And that leads me to the impression a lot of people tend to have of open source. And I thank my friend Simon Roskovsky for pointing out this this comic, because I think it's brilliant. So here you've got modern software and all the pieces that go into building it, and it all stands on this tiny little piece that, according to the comic, some random person in Nebraska has been thanklessly maintaining since 2003. And that's unfortunately an impression a lot of people commonly have of open source, that it's just some random bored guy sitting in their basement cranking out code because they've got nothing else to do. That's very, very wrong. And I'm going to come back to talk about that in more details. But let's talk about some examples. So in the news recently, a lot of you may have heard about something called Log4j, which is a popular open source component used by Java. And in the news, basically, they discovered a security problem with Log4j. Now, security issues are never a good thing. There's no question about it. But is it really bad when you find a high-profile security bug in open source? Not really, because the nice thing about open source is that A, transparency, and B, you have a community of people who are going to roll up their sleeves and help fix that problem. So, that community feel combined with the transparency makes the difference. Just to compare, the Log4j example, think about the Intel security bug called Spectre from not too long ago, and think about the difference of how these two were handled. Think about how long Spectre was on the news versus how long Log4j was on the news. Log4j pretty much disappeared right away. Which then leads me to talk about the concept of what you get what you pay for is definitely incorrect and does not apply for open source. There are reasons why it does. On this page, what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to give examples of 2 open source packages that are considered to be the absolute best or one of the best in their categories. Now, I recognize these 2 might not necessarily be relevant to everybody here, depending on what it is that you do, but stay with me because we're going to transition to something that's a bit more friendly. So on the left, you have PostgreSQL. It's a very popular database engine. So think about, equivalents of something like Oracle database, Microsoft SQL Server, MySQL may have been another option you have heard of, which, by the way, is also open source. Ubuntu is a popular flavor of Linux. Now, of course, everybody's got their favorite flavors of Linux. Some people may prefer CentOS, but Ubuntu generally is an easy, prominent example. So these 2 are important because whenever you're starting a new project, if you're doing development or machine learning or something along those lines, in software, it would be considered to be a mistake for you not to start building on top of something like this, because you're basically reinventing the wheel. There's actually a word for it in software development jargon, which is called a design anti-pattern. So it's something that you do not want to do. So the thing to think about here as far as building blocks go is think about Microsoft as an example with their Internet Explorer. They tried and tried and tried for years and decades to create their own browser, which everybody knew was terrible. And it honestly it felt like it was just getting worse and worse and worse until they decided, okay, this is it, we're done. And then around the time they came out with Edge, they actually switched to using Chromium under the hood, which is an open source component. Again, it's the concept of build it on top of something else rather than reinvent the entire wheel. So an example a lot of you may actually relate with. So a lot of you may be using something or used something called WhatsApp. And if you don't, you can also Google it. So WhatsApp is an extremely popular messaging application. I find it to be generally more popular outside North America. It is popular in North America, but it seems like a de facto standard in parts of Europe and Asia. So, this is not as specialized a product as something like Postgres or Ubuntu Linux. This is something everybody pretty much had on their phones. These guys are owned by Facebook, also known as Meta. And in January, I think it wasn't January. Sorry, I'm getting my dates mixed up. But at some point, they released an update where they revised their privacy policy. And now there was the suspicion of them basically selling your data to Facebook to feed you advertising. Long story short, people get annoyed and people wanted to go to a more private option. So where did these people go? They went to something called Signal. Now, Signal, as you may have guessed, is open source. It's actually one of the most popular open source projects in the world at this point. And this just leads to enforce my point of open source. Most experts will agree is considered to be more secure and better respecting of people's privacy, just by virtue of the fact that it's transparent, community supported, etc. That makes a lot of difference. I'm an avid reader of Consumer Reports, and I've actually recently saw an article they created where they evaluated a bunch of VPN services. And Consumer Reports reserved the top marks for only the VPN services that actually ran open source, again, because of security. Now that leads you to thinking, okay, this is great. I'm starting to think about open source now, Mohannad, but how do these people make money? Like, how can they sustain themselves? That's a really good question. There are multiple models of how open source funds itself. I'm going to explore 3 very quickly here, but there's a lot more. So Signal, as an example, takes donations. If you use the Signal app, you can basically donate, and then that's one way they can sustain and cover some of their costs. Now, remember, a lot of the people who are actually putting in the code are actually volunteers. Some might be paid. We'll talk about that in more detail. But generally speaking, they obviously have ancillary costs they have to cover, hosting, services, etc. So donations is one way. If you look at Ubuntu, the company behind it called Canonical offers a subscription-based model for services. So you can pay a subscription fee, and then that gives you, priority access to support and things like that. And then the third option is freemium. So something like WordPress, you can actually take the software and deploy your own copy if you have your own hosting or web server. But if you don't, and you just want the easy way to use it, they have an option through the WordPress.com service where you can pay for them to host a copy for you. And the most basic tier is actually free, but then there are tiers, if I was to scroll down on that page, which cost money. Now, of course, there are a lot more examples that we could talk about. One of the other examples is, often you'll find things like, Apache, Hadoop, or Spark, where there are third-party companies that offer commercial support. But again, not enough time to get into the weeds and into the details here. Now, this is where I really want this to be an eye-opener for everybody. This is where I meant by open source is everywhere. Open source is in pretty much everything you use. So I didn't want to crowd this slide with too many examples. I just wanted to keep it really simple. Any one of you on this call is probably using at least one of these 4, if not more. A lot of us use Chrome, and guess what? Chrome is built on open source. Chrome is actually built on something called Chromium, which is open source. And Chromium, in turn, was built on top of something called WebKit, which is also open source. And again, here we're talking again about the stacking, how one thing can be used to build another thing, and it just gets bigger and better, right? So it's a common theme with open source being the building block for something bigger and better. macOS is another example of that. macOS is built on something called BSD. Apple doesn't like to talk about this a lot, but that's the truth. It's based on an open source product. Even things within macOS like Safari are also based on open source because it's based on WebKit. iOS is also based on BSD. It's similar. It's pretty much a fork of macOS when it started. Apple, I hate to tell you if you're an Apple fanboy, is actually a master of taking open source stuff, adding a little bit of secret sauce on top, and then rebranding it as something that people assume is just super cool and, just totally invented by Apple. One random example I'm going to give is AirPlay. AirPlay is actually built on open source technology called Wi-Fi Direct. So other devices have it. They may not have it as polished as the Apple version because of that secret sauce, but nonetheless, it is based on open source. And now we get to the last one on the slide, Android. And some of you are probably thinking, Mohannad, Android is fully open source. What are you talking about? And you'd be right that Android itself is open source, but when you use Android on a phone, it's actually not fully open source. Almost every phone manufacturer has proprietary extensions on top of Android. So whether you're using a Samsung or a Google Pixel or many of the other brands, they most likely have customized it just a little bit or sometimes quite a bit to make it their own, just to be a little different. Now, Now that we've talked about the big tech giants like Google and Apple, what does their footprint look like on open source? And to do that, let's go have a look at GitHub. So GitHub is a super popular website for sharing open source code on the internet. And if we look at the web pages of big tech companies on GitHub, we can see Amazon over here, for example. They have 139 repositories. Repositories is the word for projects that are open source. AWS, part of Amazon, has 318. So as you can see, that's a lot of open source that they're putting out. Now, this open source in this case could be anything. Sometimes it's a software development kit. So that's what they give you as code samples and libraries that you could use to develop stuff on top of their stack. But they also do contribute outright open source projects, like things that you could just pick up and use independently of their services. So look at Google as an example. Google has 2,200 open source repositories on GitHub. And it doesn't stop there, because companies like Google, for example, are actually funding open source projects in other ways. They actually pay to fund developer positions on projects like WebKit and Linux and so on and so forth. So that's another way they all contribute to the open source ecosphere. Microsoft is another big example. You can see here Microsoft has 4,500. And of course, we're not comparing the numbers here. This is not a race, but this is still significant. Now, fun fact about Microsoft, they actually own GitHub. That's that website that allows people to put their code on for free. Microsoft owns that website. So that's another way they basically contribute to the open source ecosystem. Now, for historical facts, Microsoft did not create GitHub. It was created before. They purchased it, but they've kept it going. Even companies that are perceived to be less open in a sense, like Apple, still has a decent presence. 150 repositories may not be as much as what Microsoft or Google had, but it's still better than nothing. So even Apple contributes to open source one way or another. And guess what? It does not stop with big tech. It actually even goes to big governments, so to speak. This screenshot is from code.gov, which is a website run by the American government. In fact, the American government in August 2016 actually announced a federal law that all federal agencies must be using 20% of open source code, or whatever code they developed would be at least 20% open source. So you see that even the government, which is usually very paranoid about security and privacy of their stuff and cutting edge, still see value in open source. Because a lot of the time when you put out that code on the internet, you're basically getting more people to look at it, and these people can then contribute bug reports or like, hey, you missed this or you did this. So this is all great. Unfortunately, though, I know hopefully by now you're convinced that open source is a great idea, but how do most people come into touch with open source? That's an unfortunate coincidence. This little meme is actually a funny one because it kind of summarizes how most people stumble upon open source. Now, this is from Squid Game. I don't actually watch it. I do not intend on watching it, but I think the idea still carries. So most people will have this old machine kicking around that is either running an extremely old version of Windows and is no longer usable, or maybe you have something somewhat recent and Microsoft just broke the news to you that you're not going to be able to get on Windows 11. So what do? You go and think about alternatives like Linux, maybe Ubuntu or something like that. So this tongue-in-cheek example, again, talks about how people decide to kind of think about, hey, what's on the other side? But what I want you to think about is what this actually means on a much bigger level than just us. Think about resource preservation as an example, right? We all talk about how we're great with recycling, but a lot of us forget that it's not recycling, it's the 3 R's. So the first R is reduce, second R is reuse, and then recycling. So buy less, try to reuse as much as you can, and recycle. And guess what? Open source is perfect for that reuse Because in the case of old PCs, once you put something like Linux on this, you'll be surprised how this super old crappy machine is now suddenly turned out to be spritey and performant. Because sometimes that software could be a lot more efficient. Now, I'll talk a little bit more about that in just a second, but what I want to emphasize here is think about what that actually means for things like environmental protection and resource preservation at a global level, right? If you're able to take an old machine and reuse it, give it another life, you've basically spared another machine being manufactured. And in fact, a lot of the hardware that we no longer use can sometimes be shipped to other parts of the world where it's repurposed with open source software to teach kids in schools about technology and stuff like that. So that goes a long way in preserving environment. But speaking of old PCs, this is an example from real life. So what you're looking at here is a machine that I personally built more than 10 years ago. Now that machine actually never had Windows, but a couple of years ago, my son became interested in playing Minecraft, and he needed something to do this. So I put Minecraft on this machine, and it worked perfectly fine for what he needed. Imagine this, it's a 10-year-old machine. How often do you see a 10-year-old machine being able to do anything at all? Or like at most, it would be like basic web browsing. In fact, especially with COVID and a lot of kids going online schooling, I've actually found myself taking a lot of old hardware from people in my circles, neighborhood and whatnot, and flashing the machines with things like Chrome OS or Ubuntu Linux, and then suddenly these machines have a second life, and these kids can now have better access to online schooling. And that's in a rich country. I live in Canada, but that still made a difference. So again, think about the difference this could make for low, middle income type of countries. Now, I don't want to spend too much time talking about this without getting into really the main topic here, which is open source and imaging informatics. So what does it look like? Here, I tried to just give you a taste of what might be out there. Keep in mind, there's a ton out there. And I'm pretty sure that those of you who might already be familiar with open source have a favorite piece of open source software that I've missed on this slide. And I apologize for that. But I just tried to make this representative as much as I could. So again, small sample here. Before I get too deep talking about this small sample, remember when we talked about the concept of stacking things to make something bigger? Well, you guessed it. Some of these things were actually built on top of each other. So DVTK over here under my mouse is actually one of the building blocks that created Orthanc. Orthanc is a PAX implementation, open source PAX implementation. Cornerstone is the building blocks for the Open Health Imaging Foundation viewer. It's pretty much the de facto open source web DICOM viewer, and so on and so forth. Now, these open source products, in case you have not run into them, enable a wide range of applications. They do different things. So they're not really categorized in any way. They're pretty much random right now. But these can go anywhere from imagine in a low-income country, this can actually enable a digital workflow that otherwise may not have been possible because you don't have the funds to do something else, right? In middle-income countries, for example, Latin America, they sometimes have some money to spend, but not necessarily enough money to spend on commercial. So what they'll often do is they'll take one of these open source solutions and then build something on top of it that is custom to their needs. And that's also another great example. But even in what we like to call ourselves, like here in North America, Western Europe, rich countries, open source can still play a major role. Think about, a research project. You can deploy something like Orthanc to be a research PAX, right? Or thinking about a simple use case of DICOM routing, or, having a backup redundant system or things like that. There's a lot you could do with open source in that regard, right? Now, unfortunately, as pointed out by my two friends, Howard Chen and Don Dennison, hospital IT tends to shy away from open source because to them, time is money. And they feel like with open source, the catch with free is that it takes up your time. They prefer to have a support contract because the market is just generally more conditioned to pay commercial for vendor support. This way, you're shifting a lot of your long-term employee costs into yearly contracts. This way you can hire more generalists rather than needing to worry about specialists. And of course, this way you also have control, because if I can threaten you to stop paying you, I can get you to do what I want. So I get it. No judgment there. But the good news is, on a quick Google search, at least 75% of what I'm showing you on my screen enjoys some form of commercial support. And if you're wondering, no, this is not rigged. I did not go and intentionally choose ones that had commercial support. I chose ones that I wanted to put on the slide and then checked if they have commercial support. At least 75% of these enjoy some form of commercial support using one of the models I showed you earlier. Some of them may take donations. Some of them may actually have an outright services option. Some of them may be supported by a third party that offers commercial support. But if that's what you want for peace of mind, it's an option. Now, we can't talk about imaging IT without talking about sort of the next and upcoming thing, which is, of course, AI and machine learning. And AI and machine learning definitely is based on a lot of open source products. You probably have heard the data scientists in your institution talking about the Jupyter notebooks. That's open source. You probably heard them talk about using frameworks like PyTorch, TensorFlow, Keras. Guess what? That's open source. Spark is also open source. And again, the concept of building blocks definitely applies here, because Keras is actually built on top of TensorFlow, right? Monet is built on top of PyTorch. And that's how you can see how pieces of the puzzle kind of fit to make a bigger picture. All right. Now, open source in medical imaging goes beyond software and AI. So you have societies like SIIM and RSNA that support open source very strongly. For example, SIIM at some point had open source plugfests. SIIM has the hackathon. The hackathon has both contributed to open source first party, as well as encouraging people participating in the hackathon to open source their code. Other avenues as well that I'll talk a little bit more about with SIIM. RSNA has similar initiatives as well, right? Now, there are also major contributions to open source from other organizations. Of course, everybody here probably knows about the Cancer Imaging Archive, essentially, one of the world's biggest data sets, so to speak. You also have big institutions like MIT contributing to open source, both data sets and models. Mimic was contributed by MIT as an example. Stanford is another big example. Everybody's probably heard about Checkspert. And then NIH has a bunch of initiatives. One of the biggest ones, in my opinion, is Imaging Data Commons. And if time permits, I actually have extra links that I'd like to share later where you can find more information about some of these things. But I mentioned SIIM, and I wanted to dig a little bit deeper into it. I managed to dig up these from SIIM archives. So the first one here you see is an old version of the open source blogfest at the SIIM conference. And in here, in 2014, you see this is my friend Chris Hafey showing off Cornerstone. That's his open source project. And then here's my friend Dr. Howard Chen showing off something else. I don't actually remember what he was showing off that day, and I forgot to ask him. Of course, can't look at Howard without admiring how, until this day, he does not look like he's a day older. So kudos, Howard. One of these days, you got to tell me your secret. Seriously, though, the other one, of course, is JDI. So the Journal of Digital Imaging, as an example, had an issue in June 2018 that was fully dedicated to exploring open source. And that's not the first time they've done it. It's been done in the past. So that's another way where SIIM actually contributes to the open source movement one way or another. Open source is also very important, not just for us, people who are basically kind of providers of healthcare. It's also important for the patients. Some of you may have attended SIIM 2018. And if you did, and if you attended that keynote, I'm pretty sure you would not have forgotten ePatients Dave keynote about engaged patients. So that's definitely a strong concept in healthcare and medical, but open source can play an extremely important role in enabling engaged patient. One of the best examples I can think of is what you see on the right here. So this is the diabetes community. The diabetes community got tired of the doctors and the vendors not really giving them something that actually works as well. So they went and created this open artificial pancreas system, OpenAPS here, basically off-the-shelf hardware, open source software that basically can work as, an open source insulin pump, monitoring system, you name it. I don't want to get into a lot of details about this, but just know that, the hashtag they chose for their movement summarizes everything you need to know. And the hashtag says, "We are not waiting." They're done. They want to do this themselves. Now, that particular example hits close to home for me because this handsome little fella you see over here is my nephew. He was diagnosed at a very early age with diabetes, which, as you can imagine, was devastating for him and his parents. Now, his mother, my sister-in-law, was actually able to piece together an open source system that helps them with monitoring his glucose level and also controlling the pump, similar to what you saw on the previous slide. Now, that actually enabled him to enjoy a quality of life that was not easily achievable before. So, for example, swimming was not something that was easily achievable with the hardware that was initially given to him by the hospital. But with this newer hardware, he can actually go swimming, which is what you see him doing over here. And in the circle, you see like one of those monitors that's actually stuck to his side. All right. Now, the reason I'm showing you this is because we all, at the end of the day, have to remember, no matter what you are, whether you're a doctor, you're a software engineer, you're a data scientist, any of these things, we're here because we are all trying to improve patient lives one way or another. And we all have to remember those patients are people we love, people from our community, friends, sometimes ourselves even. And that's what it really matters. Now, shifting the focus back to open source. Let's just talk about some things that may not be super obvious. So first of all, when you have open source, you do have full control over your product. That's one nice thing. So, we talked about, some hospitals prefer to have control by paying somebody. Well, here you may not necessarily be paying somebody, but you do have full control over it, right? If you want to duplicate your instance of, some open source software, or if you want to enable an extra feature, then nobody is there to tell you, "Oh, you did not pay me a license fee." You've got full control over it. You're also not locked in by any vendor. So like, let's say you use open source software A, and then one day decided you want to move over to B. You own the data, you have full access to it, whether it's database or .conf files or whatever, so you can easily move it over. And then of course, the other one is that you're basically getting new features and bugs fixed by the people who maintain these repositories without you having to do anything. Now, of course, I'm not encouraging you here not to sit around and do nothing. I do encourage you to try and contribute to open source when you can. And contributing to open source isn't what you may think it is. You don't have to be a developer to contribute to open source. A lot of these open source projects could use a number of people wearing multiple hats. It's not just code. Maybe they need somebody who can help manage their website. Maybe they just appreciate you when you find a bug, reporting the bug so they can improve it. Or maybe you can just go on the forums for that open source software and help answer other people's questions, exchange knowledge with other users. There are many ways you can help an open source project aside from just contributing code. Worst comes to worst, you could buy the existing maintainers coffee or beer or something, right? Just to show them your appreciation. You can tweet about it, spread the word. So we talked about, why hospital IT might shy away from open source. And, I've given you some good ideas. Now, one theme that keeps coming up here is maintainers and community. And again, I talked about it earlier in the slide that people have the misconception of open source being, bored guys cranking out code. I wanted to show you that's definitely not the case. So I want to show you some people that have created open source software that I absolutely admire and love, people I've spoke to personally on occasions before. And I wanted to show you that, look at them. If you just scan through the room here, they all have very fancy titles, and they're all very accomplished people. Now, this is not to say that this is the community, there's nobody else. These are just very few handpicked examples to show you that open source can actually be very good for your career and for your organization's fortunes, whether your organization is a hospital or if you're a vendor or anything. Open source can actually work for making things better for you in an indirect way, in a less selfish way. Now, again, the community is large. There's a lot of people behind some of these open source components I showed you. So again, I'm not trying to tell you these 6 people have done it all, but just the example to show that, yes, they're extremely accomplished people. It's to drive the point home that when people put out code online, they're not putting out code because they're bored. They're actually putting out a labor of love. They're actually putting out their best foot forward. And that's what they're hoping that, somebody else will come in, pitch in, use it, and contribute to, bug reports, feature requests, etc. Now, another way open source thrives would be hackathons. And hackathons can happen in multiple places. Of course, SIIM hackathon, I'm quite biased on this one, but there are really other good hackathons. So, for example, the National Alliance for Medical Imaging Computing is a great event. And coincidentally, it's actually happening this week. I promise you that was not planned, but it was a pleasant surprise. The NAMIC has been home to a lot of cool open source projects. The OHA viewers benefit from that. 3D Slicer from there, so on and so forth. Hacking for Health is a network of hackathons. Now, this is not a comprehensive list. There's a ton more out there that I cannot cover today, but these are just some examples. Now, of course, I don't want to sit here and pretend like open source is perfect and there's nothing to go wrong. There are definitely caveats with open source. So I do want to give you some basic advice on what to look for. So firstly, if I have a need for something, let's say I need a research box, how do I go and choose an open source component? So the first thing you want to look for is the code is actually being maintained. So you want to look at their repository like GitHub or something, see that the code is actually coming in somewhat regular basis. So that guarantees you updates. You look for things like testing. Do they have automated test setup? Look if they have a bug tracker set up. And look for things like mailing lists or forums where people can ask questions, exchange knowledge, put in feature requests, right? And then remember that when you're dealing with open source, you also have control over, bugs and security issues. So you may choose to pin your open source dependency to specific versions so that you avoid things breaking, but then that can, of course, expose you to, missing out on security updates. So you want to kind of decide about what you want to do. And then, of course, there's always the question, what do I do if my component is longer maintained? And let's just pause here for a second and explain that software has a shelf life. So everything at some point will become unmaintained. But in this case, there's no magical option. It's basically, you could either switch to an alternative, library or component that does a similar job, or you could, in theory, maintain it yourself. But remember, as I said, all software has a shelf life. It's kind of like, for us living in North America, and we're spoiled. At some point, people decide, I'm done with my kitchen. I'm going to completely redo my kitchen or my bathroom. It's something like that. Software can get really old, and at some point, it may just need to be completely redone. The last point, of course, is HIPAA and FDA compliance. Now, there is no magical bullet here. It's basically your mileage may vary, and you got to do your own homework. But I will give you some points to think about. So it's not that open source is more or less compliant out of the box. It's just more about you looking deeper into what it supports and what not. Things like authentication, how that's handled, authorization, auditing. Does it encrypt things at rest? Does it encrypt things in transit? When you use open source software, you may need to host it somewhere. So, for example, let's say you're hosting it in the Amazon cloud. You can enable encryption in your S3 storage, as an example. Maybe you can think about scenarios where you could write once and then only read from that storage. So this way, you're less likely for somebody taking your data hostage, as an example. Same with FDA. Like right now, none of the open source projects necessarily have like any FDA evidence. That may change in the future. Some of those commercial maintainers may actually help in the future provide some of that to make it easier. But of course, the other thing to keep in mind is that the rules apply differently depending on whether you're a health service provider versus a vendor. So you have a little bit more leeway if you're in a hospital environment as far as choosing what tools you want to use. Now, I want to get personal one more time, because one of my favorite quotes in the world is, "Be the change you want to see in the world." It's a quote by Gandhi. So just to show you that open source is not a subpar experience, I'm personally somebody who likes to lead by example, and it's definitely the case when it comes to open source adoption. So I'm a full-time Linux user, and I actually wanted to show you the view from the other side where I'm standing right here. This is what my desk looks like, and I'm sorry, I know it's a little messy, but what I want you to see, so let me just preface this by saying I'm not here to convert you. I don't want you to switch to Linux today, but I'm just showing you it's not scary like some people might think it is, right? So here's my laptop. This is a Dell XPS. It's a modern, sleek laptop. It's the equivalent of a MacBook Air for the Apple fanboys. It actually shipped from Dell with Ubuntu Linux installed. And here you see it plugged into a dock, 2 monitors, camera, and my keyboard and mouse, even my fancy microphone that I bought because I'm one of the volunteers of the SIIMcast. And while we're here, shout out to SIIMcast. But this is showing you that it's a first-class experience. It's not a second-class experience. It works. A lot of people assume that, oh God, if I switch to Linux, I'm going to have to accept this not working and this not working. It's not true. Sometimes it may take some fiddling, but it's not always the case. Which then leads me to this very funny meme I found on the internet. It says, GitHub is Facebook for programmers. No, it's not. Programmers are not on GitHub to snoop on each other or, date each other or anything like that. They're there to actually put out their best foot forward. It's, again, a labor of love. But unfortunately, that's what a lot of people have as an impression of open source and the developers behind it. So hopefully today you've been somewhat educated and, you had your eye opened on what open source actually means, the perceived risks of open source. And what I'm hoping you're going to do is you're going to take this and educate people in your organization and your circles about what open source actually does. Open source is often seen a lot riskier than it actually is. So yeah, please talk to people. I think SIIM usually posts these webinars on YouTube. So maybe this webinar will be available that you can send people to, and so on and so forth. And of course, don't forget the strategies I gave you about avoiding potential issues with open source. We talked about seeing if a project is alive, so on and so forth. So as I promised you, I told you that open source is everywhere. I'm hoping you're going to consider open source next time you have a need for something like that. And please turn around and educate others when you can. Okay. Keep in mind, commercial support is available if you need that for peace of mind or regulations or hospital rules or whatever. And if you want a stretch goal beyond these 3, contribute your software to open source. Maybe you picked up something and you fixed a bug in it. Consider putting that back into the original project. Put it out to the community. Or maybe you created something. Now, you may not think of that as novel. Most developers like myself, when I create something, I don't think of it as novel. But sometimes when you just put it out there, you'll be surprised how some people may actually find it useful. So don't be shy to just put out stuff out there. And with that, I want to thank everybody for listening in. I'll be happy to take questions while we have time here today. But if you want to get in touch offline, you can find me on Twitter or via email. So thank you all for listening, and I'll pass it back to Nikki.
Thank you so much, Mohannad. That was a wealth of amazing information and knowledge. Before we go to the continuing education, let's talk a little bit about a few questions that came through, and maybe even just a couple of statements that folks have made in the chat. The first one is from Matt Bishop, and he says, and this is really good advice, even if you don't or can't necessarily use open source software in production, you can always use it to help solve problems and learn along the way. So I thought that was just a really good statement. So we have a couple of questions here. I think we kind of answered them, but maybe just take a moment to reiterate, the answers to them. So the first one is, since many open source apps are built on top of other objects, You mentioned earlier about, that one guy in Nebraska, right, who's maintaining it. But what happens if an underlying project fails or stops being supported? Like, how do you handle that?
Well, as I mentioned in the presentation, unfortunately, no magical solution. Chances are, if they stopped maintaining it, it's either getting too old or maybe the community around it was just fading. So it's your choice whether you decide to roll up your sleeve and maintain it yourself if you've got the skills, or you just decide it's time to move on. It's kind of like an old car where it gets too expensive to repair. It's maybe just time to find a new car.
Thank you. Another one, which you kind of touched on again, but I think just worth, you reminding folks of your answer is, are there any regulatory or legal concerns around patient information when using open source apps in medicine? This is actually a 3-part question. That was the first. Any legal concerns? What if I'm using an open source viewer that is not FDA or government approved? Are there any, risks to my organization?
Yeah, absolutely. So the first part, as far as legal, the only obvious one here would be the license of whatever open source component that you might be using or product. FDA and HIPAA compliance, really, again, your mileage varies. You'll need to do your homework. But as I said earlier in the presentation, just make sure you recognize that there's a difference to how the rules apply depending on whether you're a provider like a hospital versus a vendor.
This one is a little more country specific question. So in dental radiology, even now, companies are using proprietary file formats instead of DICOM, mainly in 2D X-ray. Why do you think that is? And why they're already acting that way? And this person in general is using OMFR in Brazil. So, why do you think they're doing this?
Yeah, that's a good question. So again, not to take a stab at vendors, but the reality is vendors react to market demand. So by default, the easy choice is I'm going to use my own proprietary format, or stick with JPEG. But if the vendors are always getting requirements from people who are purchasing their software that they should be supporting proper standards like DICOM, well, that's what they're going to do. So I always say, when people talk about cool new standards, that it's a chicken egg problem. We can create cool standards all day long, but until they're mandated by people in their RFPs, they're not going to go anywhere. They're just going to be ink on paper.
Lots of good resources that additional folks are throwing in here. So what I'll do is after this, I'll also pull together some of those resources that folks are throwing out to the community here, and be sure to put them in a place for everybody to see. But this is a really important question, Mohannad. You had a picture of your desk. What mic is that you're using?
That's a really good question. It's a Blue Yeti Mini, I think it was called. Whoever's interested, feel free to email me and I'll send you the link. It's not that fancy. It looks fancy.
All right.
I'll tell you this, it doesn't hold a candle to whatever Brad Jenner has on his desk.
Here's another great question: is what is your favorite open source imaging app?
Oh, that's a hard one. You're going to make me choose. This is kind of like asking somebody about their favorite child. I can't say, honestly. I mean, I have a bunch of favorites. I'm a huge fan of Orthanc. It's a great piece of software, extremely flexible and usable. OHIV Viewer is another one. OHIV Viewer enabled a lot of things to happen. And I don't have time to get into the details, but yeah, these are probably, some of the 2 favorites I have.
And just to clarify, it's the middle child is always the favorite. No bias here, but still. And one last is kind of a comment and question tied together. One of the researchers at the hospital where I've been working wanted to have the RSNA software CTP installed to try for de-identification. The IT folks would not allow it due to security. They said that they are not allowed to install any open source software. Is this common in a hospital environment?
Is it common? Unfortunately, yes. It feels like it's more common than I would like to see. And I feel like it comes back to misunderstanding. CTP is a great piece of software. I personally use it. I'm a huge fan of it. So it's really unfortunate that they couldn't see through that. Again, I feel like it comes back to education. Sometimes between you and I know it's recorded, but I'll just say this. There are times when it's easier to ask for forgiveness than permission. So just keep an open mind.
I love it. All right, so that is the end of our questions at this point. I'm seeing a lot of folks actually throw in their own favorite open source. And, let's take a moment here, everybody, if you have your favorite open source software or application that you're using, please throw it into the chat for us. That's something that we can continue to pull from, and I can throw into a resource folder for everybody after this. So yeah, if you have your favorite, please definitely throw it in there. I'm seeing, Conquest, I'm seeing DCMTK, I'm seeing a lot of different great open source applications that may not have been mentioned in your presentation. So thank you, everybody. And just want to say once again, thank you so much to Barco for supporting the SIIM22 Enterprise Imaging webinar series. And thank you, Mohannad. This was amazing information. You all can learn more from Mohannad at our upcoming hackathon, which will be the week prior to SIIM22. Thank you again and have a great day.
Thank you so much. Have a great day, everyone.